Good evening, and welcome back. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to stand beside a dusty road outside Jerusalem 900 years ago as the light faded over the hills, and to watch a single knight in a plain white mantle kneel by the roadside and light a lantern so that pilgrims walking through the dark would know the road was watched and that someone was keeping the night for them? That small, quiet act, one flame at the edge of a long road, is where tonight's journey begins. Because the whole vast story of the Knights Templar, the rise, the riches, the mystery, and the legend that outlived them all, really does begin with something that simple. Men who promised to keep a road safe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you are listening from somewhere special tonight, drop your location and your local time in the comments below. I always enjoy reading where everyone is settling in. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Long before there was an order, before there were white mantles and red crosses, before there were castles on islands and vaults full of silver, there was a road. In fact, there were many roads, old ones, worn smooth by centuries of feet, winding down from the ports on the coast of the Holy Land, up through valleys of olive trees and dry riverbeds, climbing slowly into the hills of Judea toward the city that three faiths called sacred. Jerusalem sat on its high ground the same as it had for thousands of years, a city of pale stone that turned the colour of honey in the late afternoon sun. And toward that city, year after year, century after century, walked pilgrims. Picture them for a moment, moving slowly, because everything in this story moves slowly. A farmer from Normandy who had sold half of what he owned to make the journey of a lifetime. A widow from the Rhineland walking with her sister. A quiet merchant from an Italian port town fulfilling a promise made at a sickbed. They came by ship, mostly. Crowded vessels that hugged the coastlines of the Mediterranean for weeks, and they landed at harbour towns like Jaffa, where the air smelled of salt and tar and crowded markets. From the coast, Jerusalem lay some 40 miles inland, up through the hills. 40 miles does not sound like much, but those 40 miles could take a walker 3 or 4 days. And in the early years of the 12th century, they were among the most dangerous miles in the world. To understand why, we have to drift a little further back, gently, to the close of the 11th century. In the year 1099, armies from Western Europe, after a long and exhausting campaign that history remembers as the First Crusade, had captured Jerusalem and established a Christian kingdom there, along with a scattering of smaller Crusader states along the coast to the north. The great battles of that era had ended by the time our story opens. The kings and princes had claimed their cities. But a kingdom drawn on a map is one thing, and a countryside at peace is quite another. Beyond the walls of the towns, the land in between remained unsettled and unguarded. Bands of raiders moved through the hills. Local fighters who had lost homes and grazing lands in the wars watched the roads from the high ground. And down those roads, in their slow and hopeful thousands, came the pilgrims, carrying everything they owned in small bundles, utterly unprotected. The stories that reached Europe from those roads were sorrowful. Travellers set upon in the narrow passes where the road climbed between the rocks, whole parties of walkers vanishing between the coast and the holy city. During the spring of 1119, a large group of pilgrims making their peaceful visit to holy sites near the river Jordan was attacked in open country, and hundreds were lost. Word of it spread through the kingdom and back across the sea, and it settled heavily on the conscience of the age. Here was a Christian kingdom that had been won at enormous cost, and yet the very travellers it existed to welcome could not walk its roads in safety. The kingdom had knights, but they were bound to lords and castles, and could not be everywhere. The kingdom had walls, but a wall protects only what stands behind it. What the roads needed was something that did not yet exist anywhere in the world. Men trained to fight, who belonged to no lord, held no lands, sought no plunder, and had promised their lives not to a king, but to a purpose. And so we come, softly, to 9 men. History has kept only some of their names, and even those are worn smooth like river stones. Their leader was a knight from the region of Champagne, in what is now eastern France, a man in his middle years named Hugh of Payens. Beside him stood his companion Godfrey of Saint-Omer from Flanders, and beside them a small company of others, knights from France and from Flanders mostly, men who had come east with the crusading armies or in the years just after, and who had stayed when so many others sailed home. They were not wealthy, they were not young, most of them had spent decades in the saddle, and they knew exactly what the roads were like out beyond the city gates, because they had ridden them. Around the year 1119, these 9 knights came before the ruler of the kingdom, King Baldwin II, and before the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the highest churchman in the city, and they made an unusual proposal. They wished to take vows like monks, poverty, chastity, obedience, the whole solemn promise of the cloister. But instead of withdrawing into a monastery to pray behind walls, they would remain in the world, armed and mounted, and devote themselves to a single humble task. They would patrol the roads and keep the pilgrims safe. They would be monks whose prayer was protection. Nothing quite like it had ever been suggested before. Monks did not carry swords. Knights did not take vows of poverty. These men proposed to be both at once, and somehow in that troubled kingdom so far from home, the idea did not seem absurd. It seemed like an answer. King Baldwin received them kindly, and he gave them something remarkable. On the eastern side of Jerusalem rose the great platform that had once held the ancient Temple of Solomon, the broad, high, stone-paved expanse that people called the Temple Mount. Upon it stood a beautiful domed shrine, and at its southern end a large building that the Crusaders called the Palace of Solomon, which the king had been using as his royal residence. Baldwin was in the process of moving his household elsewhere in the city, and so he granted the 9 knights a wing of that building on the sacred platform to be their home. It was an astonishing address for 9 poor men. They stabled their horses in the vast vaulted chambers beneath the pavement, halls so large that later visitors claimed they could hold 1,000 animals. And from that place, from the site of the ancient sanctuary, the Brotherhood took the name it would carry for 2 centuries. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The world, in time, would shorten it. The Knights of the Temple. The Templars. Their beginnings were as humble as their name. For the first years there were still only a handful of them, and they lived on charity. Their seal, made years later, remembered this proudly. It showed two knights riding a single horse, a sign of brotherhood and of the poverty they had first embraced. Two men who between them could afford only one mount. They wore whatever clothing was given to them, patched and plain. They ate simply. Each day some of them rode out along the pilgrim roads, down toward the river or west toward the coast, and simply made themselves present. Armed men at the dangerous crossings, an escort for the slow walkers, a flame lit at nightfall where the road passed through the dark country. It is worth resting here a moment, because this is the seed of everything that follows. Before the fortresses, before the fleets, before kings owed them fortunes, the entire order was this: a few tired men on horseback, waiting at a ford with water and bread, so that strangers they had never met could walk to Jerusalem and pray. For nearly a decade they remained small and poor, and they might have stayed that way forever, a local curiosity of the Holy City, if not for what happened next. Their founder, Hugh of Payens, understood something quietly important. An order of 9 men could guard a road. Only an order of hundreds could guard a kingdom. And the men and the money to build such an order would not be found in the East. They would have to come from Europe, from the great houses and parishes of France and England and Spain, where every noble family had sons in need of a calling and sins in need of mending. So around the year 1127, Hugh of Payens did something that would change the fate of his little brotherhood completely. He went home. He sailed west with a few companions, back across the sea he had crossed decades before, and he began, patiently, to travel and to speak. He visited courts and castles. He told the story of the roads, of the pilgrims, of the 9 men and the borrowed horses. And the response, gathering slowly at first, then swelling, astonished everyone. Lords gave land. Ladies gave silver. Young knights, moved by the vision of a life that was both holy and brave, asked to join. In England and Scotland, in Flanders and Champagne and Provence, gifts began to flow toward the little brotherhood of the temple. Farms and mills and meadows, the rents of villages, the wool of flocks. Not because anyone expected those fields to be defended by knights in Jerusalem, but because giving to the order was a way of taking part in the guarding of the holy places without ever leaving home. A farm in Yorkshire could keep a knight in the saddle in Judea. That was the quiet arithmetic that would one day make the Templars the wealthiest brotherhood in Christendom. But wealth alone could not make them respectable, and respectability in that age flowed from one source above all others. The Church would have to bless this strange new thing, this order of armed monks, and say plainly that a man could serve God with a sword in his hand. And for that, Hugh of Payens sought out the most influential churchman in Europe, a man who happened, by the gentle coincidences that history is made of, to be practically family. In the hill country of Burgundy lived the abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, a frail, fierce, brilliant monk whose letters swayed popes and whose sermons could empty a town of its young men. Bernard was a kinsman of one of the original 9 knights, and he had followed the little brotherhood's progress with warm interest. When Hugh asked for his support, Bernard gave it without reserve, and the doors of Europe swung open. In January of 1129, in the cathedral city of Troyes, in Champagne, a council of churchmen gathered under a papal legate to consider the order of the temple. Hugh of Payens stood before the assembled bishops and abbots, a weathered soldier among the learned, and told them simply how his brothers lived and what they did. The council listened, deliberated, and gave the order what it had come for: official recognition, the blessing of the church itself, and a written rule, a detailed code of daily life drawn up with Bernard's guidance, adapting the ancient customs of the monastery to men who kept watch on horseback. From that winter forward, the Templars were no longer an experiment tolerated in a far-off kingdom. They were an institution of Christendom itself. The rule shaped every hour of a brother's life, and we will walk through those hours together in a little while, because there is no better lullaby in all of history than the daily routine of a medieval religious house. But first, let the order finish becoming itself. In the years after Troyes, 2 more gifts completed it. The first came from Bernard's pen. He wrote a small treatise in praise of the new knighthood, circulated wherever men could read, in which he contrasted the vain, gilded, quarrelsome knights of Europe with these plain, sworn brothers of the East. Of the worldly knights he was witheringly funny, mocking their silks and their painted shields. Of the new knights he wrote with tenderness, describing men who lived without wives, without property, without pride, in one house under one rule. His little book did more for recruitment than 100 sermons. The second gift came from the popes themselves. Over the following years, Rome granted the order a series of privileges that would define its future. The brothers would answer to no bishop, no king, no local power at all, but directly and only to the Pope. They would pay no tithes, they could build their own chapels and bury their own dead. Wherever they went in Christendom, they moved, legally speaking, as an island of independence. It made them wonderfully effective. It also, though no one could see so far ahead on that quiet morning of their history, made them dependent on a single protector in Rome, and vulnerable in a world where popes could be weak and kings could be hungry. But that trouble was still nearly 2 centuries away, further from them than the age of their founding is from the age of steamships. There was no shadow on them yet. There was only growth and sunlight and the long roads filling with white mantles. And the white mantle itself arrived in these same years. The council at Troyes granted the brothers the right to wear a habit of pure white, the colour of chosen life, and a generation later the popes added the famous finishing touch, a cross of red cloth worn upon the breast and shoulder, the colour of sacrifice. White for purity, red for the willingness to lay down life. It became, quite simply, one of the most recognisable uniforms in the history of the world. A pilgrim cresting a hill in Judea and seeing, far off, a rider in a white mantle with a red cross waiting at the crossroads, knew in a single glance that the road ahead was kept. That glance, repeated 1,000 times on 1,000 mornings, was the entire meaning of the order, and it is the image to hold gently in your mind as everything now begins to grow. Let us slow down now, even further, and spend some time inside the order's daily life, because for every hour a brother of the temple spent in a battle, he spent thousands of hours doing what we are about to describe. Bread, prayers, and horses. That was the true substance of a Templar's years, and it is a rhythm so calm and so regular that simply describing it feels like being rocked. By the middle decades of the 1200s, the Order's houses had spread across two worlds. In the east, in the Crusader lands, stood the great convents and fortresses where the fighting brothers served. In the west, scattered through France and England, through Aragon and Portugal and Italy, stood hundreds of quieter houses called commanderies. Farming estates mostly, each one a small self-contained world with its chapel, its dormitory, its barns and dovecotes and fish ponds, its orchards and mills. A commandery might hold only a dozen brothers, and most of them were not knights at all. For every brother knight in his white mantle there were perhaps 8 or 9 brother sergeants in mantles of brown or black, practical men of humbler birth, who managed the farms, shoed the horses, brewed the ale, and kept the accounts, along with chaplain brothers who sang the services and hired hands from the villages round about. The Order was, among all the things it was, one of the great farming enterprises of Europe. Its true daily music was not the trumpet. It was the creak of a cart, the murmur of psalms through a chapel wall, the steady breathing of oxen. A brother's day, under the rule, began in the deepest part of the night. Sometime after midnight, a bell rang softly in the dormitory, where each man slept clothed in shirt and breeches, a lamp always burning, as the rule required. The brothers rose in silence and walked through the dark to the chapel for the night office, the long. Low chanting of psalms that monks across the world offered while everyone else slept. If you had stood in the courtyard of a commandery in Provence on such a night, under the enormous stars, you would have heard it drifting out to you, that unhurried male murmur, rising and falling like slow water. When the office ended, the knights among them were permitted a homely duty before returning to bed. Each man went out to the stable to check his horses, to see that they had feed and water, and that nothing ailed them, and then, if he wished, he stood a while and simply looked at them. The rule of a mighty order, blessed by popes, paused in the deep middle of the night for a man to lay his hand on a horse's neck in the dark. Then he went back to his bed and slept until dawn. At first light the bell rang again for the morning office. Afterward came the day's assignments, given quietly by the commander of the house. There was hay to be cut in the water meadows. There was a cart of wool to be taken to the market town. There was harness to mend, a boundary ditch to clear, a sick brother to be nursed in the infirmary, letters to be carried. The brothers went to their work and did it without chatter, for the rule loved silence, though it was gentler than a monastery's rule, since men who worked with animals and tools in all weathers could not live entirely without speech. Work paused for the offices of the day, short services scattered through the hours like beads on a string, so that the whole day was stitched through with prayer. A brother working far out in the fields who could not come in was told simply to stop where he stood and say a certain number of the Lord's Prayer, while the chapel bell rang thin and small across the distance. Imagine that for a moment, because it is one of the loveliest small images the Order left behind. A man standing alone in a half-mown meadow, scythe resting against his hip, head bowed, lips moving, while swallows turn above him in the warm air. Meals were taken together in the refectory, in silence, while one of the chaplain brothers read aloud from Scripture or from the lives of saints. The food was better than a monk's, by deliberate design, because these were men who had to be strong enough to fight or to labour, and the rule was tender on this point. Meat was served several times a week, a rare luxury in that world. The brothers ate in pairs from shared dishes, each man watching courteously that his companion had enough, and the rule instructed them to see that the portions were even, so that no brother should ever feel slighted at his own table. Wine was poured, watered and moderate. What was left over went out to the poor at the gate, always every day a fixed share of everything the house produced, for feeding the poor was written into the order's oldest duties. In many towns of medieval Europe, the most reliable meal a hungry family could count on was the one handed quietly out of a Templar gatehouse at midday. The afternoons ran on like the mornings, work and offices, offices and work. In the fighting houses of the East, the work was different in kind but identical in rhythm. There the brothers exercised the great war horses, rode in formation, practised with lance and sword, repaired armour, stood their watches on the walls. The rule governed the fighting life with the same calm precision it gave to the refectory. Each knight was allowed 3 horses and 1 squire. His equipment was listed down to the last strap, sturdy and plain, with every kind of gold and ornament forbidden. Even the bridles were to be without decoration. Vanity had been scrubbed from the life entirely. A brother owned nothing, not his mantle, not his sword, not the little knife he ate with. His letters could be read by his commander. A lock on a private bag was forbidden. When he died, everything he used went back into the common store, and his mantle passed, cleaned and mended, to the next man. In exchange, and this was the very heart of the bargain, he was carried. He would never be hungry, never unhoused, never unburied, never forgotten at the altar. Old and broken brothers were kept in the order's infirmaries with honour to the end of their days, nursed by their own, and after death each man received the same simple grave and the same prayers, whether he had been a great commander or a swineherd's son who kept the granary. In an age that was cruel almost everywhere, the order was, inside its own walls, one of the gentlest institutions in existence. Evening drew the day closed like a drawstring gathering a purse. The last office was sung as the light failed. Afterward the brothers took a small supper, and afterward came the final gathering of the day, called compline, and a shared drink of watered wine. And then the great silence began. From that point until morning no brother spoke, except in true need. They checked the horses one last time. They lay down clothed in the dormitory, the small lamp burning at the end of the long room. Outside, the mill wheel turned slowly in the dark stream. The dovecote rustled and settled, and the watch on the gate leaned on his spear and looked out at the road. The endless road, which somewhere far to the east ran all the long miles up to Jerusalem. And in 100 such houses, in a dozen countries, several thousand men who owned nothing at all fell asleep at the same hour, in the same silence, under the same rule. If you are beginning to feel your own eyes grow heavy, follow them down. That is exactly the pace tonight's story wishes to keep. Yet a puzzle sits quietly at the heart of all this plainness, and it is the puzzle that makes the Templars one of the strangest and most fascinating stories of the whole medieval world. How did men sworn to individual poverty become, collectively, so staggeringly rich, that kings would one day borrow the ransom of nations from them? The answer is not greed. The answer is trust. And it unfolds so naturally, step by gentle step, that watching it happen is like watching a river find its way downhill. Begin with the gifts. From the 1130s onward, donations poured into the order without pause, decade after decade. A dying lord left them a vineyard for the good of his soul. A childless couple deeded them a mill. Kings granted them the rents of whole districts. Each gift was recorded, managed, and made productive, because the order needed steady money more than it needed land itself. Every commandery in Europe existed, in the end, to send its surplus east, to pay for war horses and wall repairs and grain, in a land where the order's expenses were bottomless. This yearly stream of value flowing from west to east was the order's bloodstream, and to move it, the brothers had to become experts in everything that moving wealth requires. Accounting, warehousing, shipping, currency, slowly. Without ever intending it, the sworn poor of Christ assembled the most reliable financial network the Western world had seen since the fall of Rome. And then came the beautiful idea, the one that still touches your life and mine every single day, though hardly anyone knows to thank a monk in a white mantle for it. It began with the pilgrims, as everything in this story does. A pilgrim setting out from Paris toward the Holy Land faced a problem as old as travel. He had to carry money, and every mile he carried it, he could lose it. Robbers on the roads of Europe, storms and wrecks at sea, thieves in the port towns, the dangers stretched the whole length of the journey. But the order kept houses along the entire route, in Paris and in the river towns, in the ports of Provence and Italy, on the islands, and in every city of the Crusader coast. Each house trusted the others absolutely, kept careful books, and answered to the same master. Some clever brother whose name history never recorded saw what that network made possible. The pilgrim did not need to carry his money at all. He could hand his silver to the brothers in Paris before he left, and receive from them a written note recording the deposit. Months later, and 2,000 miles away, he could present that note at the order's house in the east, and draw out its value there, in local coin, less a small fee for the service. The money had crossed the world, and yet no chest of coins had ever left the vault. Only a piece of writing had travelled, worthless to any thief who could not prove he was its rightful holder. It is such a quiet invention. No trumpet sounded when the first such letter was written. But rest with it a moment, because you have almost certainly used its descendants, the traveller's cheque, the bank draft, the wire transfer, the card in your wallet that turns a debt in one city into bread in another. All of them stand in a line of descent that runs back through the counting rooms of Renaissance Italy to a plain table in a Templar house, where a tired man in a dusty cloak slid a bag of coins across the wood and received in exchange a promise. The order had discovered the great secret on which all banking rests, which is that money, in the end, is trust wearing a disguise. And no institution in that world was more trusted than they were. They could not lie about the balance, men reasoned, because they feared God. They could not steal it, because they had sworn away wealth itself. They could not be robbed, because they were the finest soldiers alive, and their houses were fortresses. Every quality the order had built for entirely spiritual reasons turned out to be exactly the quality a banker needs most. So the services multiplied, gently, one leading to the next. If the brothers could hold a pilgrim's silver, they could hold anything. Nobles departing on crusade left the family treasure in the local temple house, sometimes for years, and it was always there when they returned, every ring and penny accounted for in the brothers' patient ledgers. Merchants deposited trading capital with them. Bishops parked the revenues of their sees. Contracts, wills, crowns, and royal seals went into Templar vaults for safekeeping, because a document stored with the order was beyond the reach of every quarrelling party, and from holding money it was the smallest of steps to lending it, discreetly, soundly, against pledges and rents, in the manner the age permitted. Kings came to them in their emergencies. When a king of France ran short of silver for his daughter's dowry, the temple advanced it. When ransoms had to be raised, when campaigns had to be paid for, when a royal treasury needed to be tided over from one harvest tax to the next, the white mantles were sent for. By the turn of the 13th century, the order's great house in Paris had drifted into service as something very close to the royal treasury of France itself, its brothers keeping the kingdom's accounts with a competence no royal clerk could match, and that arrangement would hold, on and off, for 100 years. The poor knights had become the bankers of Christendom. Not one of them owned so much as the ink he wrote with. While the silver flowed and the ledgers filled, the order's other hand was busy with stone. Because guarding pilgrims, it turned out, was a task that kept growing. A road is only as safe as the country around it, and country is only as safe as the strongholds that watch it. So through the middle years of the 12th century, the brothers became builders, and what they built still stands, in ruins and in whole, along the coasts and hilltops of the eastern Mediterranean, some of the most beautiful and most patient architecture the medieval world ever raised. Their castles were not the gloomy piles of storybooks. Most began as simple watchtowers over a spring or a pass, and grew, ring by ring, into small fortified towns. There was a great one at Gaza in the south, anchoring the road to Egypt. There was the famous white fortress at Safed in the hills of Galilee, so large that chroniclers counted the daily bread of its garrison in thousands of loaves. On the coast north of Jaffa, on a headland that pushed out into the sea, the brothers would one day raise the mightiest of them all, a castle so surrounded by water that its wells drew sweet, and its walls could be supplied by ship no matter what happened on land. Sailors coming up the coast saw its towers from miles out, pale against the blue, and pilgrims sheltering inside heard the waves breaking on 3 sides of their beds all night long, the sea itself standing guard. Life in these strongholds moved to the same rhythm as life in a farm commandery, only with salt in the air and watchfulness on the walls, the bell in the small hours, the psalms in the vaulted chapel. The horses fed and watered before all else. Grain came in by cart and by boat, was ground in the castle mills, was baked in ovens the size of small rooms. Cisterns caught the winter rains and kept them cool and dark under the courtyards for the long dry summer. Smiths hammered, ropes creaked, sentries changed with the officers of the day, and in the evening the garrison ate together in silence, while a reader's voice rose and fell above the sound of the wind. Many of the men stationed in such places passed entire decades without ever drawing a sword in anger. Their war was maintenance, Their heroism was the repaired wall, the full storehouse, the road patrolled at dawn, the beacon lit at dusk. And between the castles moved the Order's most persistent creation, its network. Couriers rode with letters sewn into their saddlebags, changing horses at Templar houses spaced a day's ride apart. Supply columns wound down from the hill farms to the coast. Small patrols, 2 knights and a handful of sergeants made their steady circuits of the pilgrim roads, learning every well, every olive grove, every family of shepherds by name. The brothers came to know the land with a tenderness that surprised visitors from Europe. They spoke the languages of their neighbours. They employed local guides, hired local masons, bought barley and honey and horses at local markets, and traded courtesies with the very lords they might face in a campaign season. More than one traveller recorded, with astonishment, that the fiercest knights in Christendom exchanged gifts and physicians with their opponents between wars, and were on friendly visiting terms with them because the East ran on relationships, and the Order had learned patience the same as stone learns moss. The sea, too, became theirs. It had to. Everything the Order was in the Crusader lands floated on the yearly convoys from the west, and rather than rent forever, the brothers built and bought ships of their own. Templar galleys and round-bellied transports worked the passage between the ports of Provence and Italy and the harbours of the East, carrying pilgrims outward in the spring sailing season, carrying letters and silver and old tired brothers homeward in the autumn. At Marseille the Order kept its own dock and its own officials, and the pilgrim traffic they handled grew so large that the city's shipowners complained the white mantles were taking their trade. A pilgrim who sailed on the Order's ships slept under the same discipline that ruled its houses, and mothers were said to prefer those ships above all others, for no crew was steadier and no vessel better provisioned. And if a storm came, the men who worked the ropes had sworn their lives away long ago and did not panic. By the 1160s and 70s then, picture the whole quiet machine at work, spread across an afternoon of the world. In a Yorkshire meadow, sheep are being shorn, and their wool will become silver in a Flanders market, and that silver will travel guarded roads to a vault in Paris. In Paris, a clerk brother enters figures in a ledger and seals a letter of credit for a knight departing east. In Marseille, that knight walks up a gangway between coils of rope, and a brother of the Order checks his name against a list. On the open sea, a convoy leans together into the wind. In an island harbour, casks of water are swung aboard. On the coast of the Holy Land, porters carry sacks of grain up from a beach to a storehouse, and a commander signs for them, and a courier takes the tally inland, riding from tower to tower, and at each tower a sentry marks him coming from far off and opens the small gate. And at the top of the last hill, in the city itself, in the great convent on the southern edge of the old sacred platform, the master of the Order hears the evening reports, how the roads are, how the wells are, how many pilgrims came up this week from the coast, and then goes in to sing the last office of the day with his brothers. Every piece of it, field and fleece, coin and keel, wall and well, existed for the sake of the traveller on the road. The Order never forgot its founding image, and neither should we tonight. All of this was scaffolding around a lantern. It would be untrue and unkind to the truth to pretend the Order had no flaws in its golden age, It had the flaws of every large and successful institution. Some brothers were proud. Some commanders loved their independence a little too well, and quarrelled with bishops, and squeezed their tenants, and tested the patience of their friends. Kings found them useful and occasionally infuriating, since the order obeyed no one locally, paid no local taxes, and could not be commanded, only asked. Their great sibling brotherhood, the Hospitallers, who ran hospitals for the sick and fielded knights in equal measure, was sometimes their dearest ally and sometimes their rival, and the two houses competed for gifts, for castles, and for renown in ways that older, wiser heads on both sides openly regretted. Chroniclers of the age scolded them now and then, the same as one scolds family, but even the scolders conceded the centre of the matter. When the roads had to be kept, the white mantles kept them. When a campaign was mustered, they came first and left last. When everything else in the Crusader states shifted with politics and marriage and money, the order remained what it had been, permanent, disciplined, and paid for out of a purse no local quarrel could empty. For 2 full generations, that permanence held the whole fragile coast together the same as a keel holds a ship. And the years for a long while were kind. Children were born in the coastal towns who grew old without ever seeing a great war. Vineyards crept back up hillsides that had once been burned. The pilgrim traffic swelled decade by decade, and the order swelled to meet it. New houses, new towers, new wells dug and old ones cleaned, until a walker on the Jaffa road could pass from the sea to the holy city and hardly ever be out of sight of a place where help lived. Old brothers who remembered the first poor years told the young recruits how it had been. 2 men to a horse, bred by charity, and the young men listened politely and privately, could not imagine it. The order they had joined held thousands of estates. Its name was good from Scotland to the river Jordan. Its treasuries balanced the budgets of kingdoms, and its towers watched the most contested coastline on earth, and all of it ran, day after day, on the same unhurried clockwork of bells and psalms and horses fed before men. If the story could pause anywhere forever, it would pause here, in the long golden afternoon of the order's 2nd generation, with the wheat coming in and the sea lanes full of sails. But history does not pause, it only breathes. And far to the east and south of the quiet roads, in lands the pilgrims never saw, something new was gathering, slowly, patiently, over many years, the same gathering a watcher on a headland feels when the wind changes out at sea long before any cloud shows. The scattered rivals of the Crusader states were becoming, for the first time in a century, a single thing, under a single will. The name attached to that will belong to a quiet, bookish, chess-loving man from a Kurdish family, a man even his opponents would come to describe with respect and something close to affection. His name was Saladin, and with him the long afternoon of our story turns, gently, toward evening. Saladin's rise, like everything else in this story, happened slowly, and it is best understood not as a storm but as a tide. He began as a young officer in the service of a great lord of Damascus, was sent almost against his wishes to Egypt, and there, through patience, competence, and a gift for being trusted, rose to rule the richest land on the southern sea. In the years that followed, gently and not so gently, he drew the cities of the region under his hand, first Cairo, then Damascus, then the towns of the great rivers far to the northeast, until the Crusader states along the coast, which had always lived comfortably among divided neighbours, woke to find themselves bordered on every landward side by a single ruler. It took him more than a decade, and he spent as much of that decade writing letters and arranging marriages and forgiving rebels as he ever spent in the field. Those who met him recorded the same qualities over and over. He was mild in speech. He was generous past the point of prudence, and died owning almost nothing, having given the wealth of an empire away. He loved conversation about law and scholarship, wept easily, doted on his many children, and kept about him a court of learned and gentle men. The brothers of the Temple would face him for 20 years, and it is one of the kinder ironies of history that the great opponent of the sworn poor was himself, by temperament half a monk. The kingdom he faced, meanwhile, was quietly wearing thin. The great generation of builder kings in Jerusalem had passed, and the crown had come to a young man of extraordinary courage and terrible fortune, a boy king afflicted from childhood with leprosy, who ruled bravely from a failing body while his court divided into factions behind his throne. When he died young, the factions chose poorly. The wisest voices in the land, men who had grown up beside their neighbours and understood the value of every truce, were shouldered aside by newer men, ambitious, quarrelsome, and hungry for a war they did not understand. It is an old story, and it needs no drama from us tonight. Truces were broken that should have been kept. Caravans were raided that should have passed in peace. Insults were given that a wiser court would have swallowed, and by the early summer of 1187 the long patience of Saladin had reached its natural end, and he crossed the river Jordan with the greatest army the region had seen in a lifetime. What followed in the first days of July of that year was the battle history remembers at the twin hills called the Horns of Hattin, above the Lake of Galilee. We will keep our promise and pass over it softly. The army of the kingdom, marching in high summer to relieve a besieged town, was drawn out onto a waterless plateau, surrounded and worn down through a day and a night of heat and thirst and smoke. By the second evening the fighting was over, and the kingdom's army in a single afternoon had effectively ceased to exist. The military brothers, Templars and Hospitallers both, who had formed the hard core of the host, bore the heaviest loss, and many of the white mantles that had ridden north that week never came home. It was the darkest day in the Order's 2 centuries, and the men of that generation carried it quietly for the rest of their lives. Let it be enough tonight to say that the lamp the Order had tended for 70 years guttered in a single day's wind, and that everything the pilgrim's world had been resting on now had to be carried by other hands, in other ways. Because with the field army gone, the cities could not stand. Through the autumn of 1187 they passed to Saladin one after another, the ports and the hill towns both, most of them by negotiation, and in October Jerusalem itself came to terms. And here the story, so heavy for a moment, grows gentle again, because Saladin at the gates of Jerusalem behaved in a manner that even the chronicles of his enemies recorded with wonder. There was no storm of the walls, no sack, no fire. A ransom was set for the inhabitants, and it was modest, and when thousands of the poor could not pay it. His own brother asked for a great number of them as a gift, and set them free on the spot. His officers, moved or shamed, released thousands more. The Eastern Christians of the city were allowed to remain in their homes. The great shrines were reconsecrated, cleansed with rosewater, and reopened for prayer, and within a few years Saladin had agreed that Western pilgrims, unarmed and peaceable, might once again walk up from the coast to visit the holy places. Think of that. The city had changed hands. The flags on the towers had changed. And yet within a short span the old familiar traffic resumed. The ships, the roads, the tired walkers looking up at the pale hills. Because the deepest current in this whole story, the human pull toward that one city, ran beneath every war and simply continued, the same as a river runs under winter ice. The Order in those years learned how to be patient in a new way. It had lost its home upon the sacred platform, its castles in the hills, and the graves of 3 generations of its brothers, and it did not, as institutions so often do, shatter or curdle. It moved its convent north to the coast, regathered its survivors, sent west for men and money, and went back to work. There was escort duty again, for the pilgrim roads reopened under treaty. There were new castles to build and old ones to ransom back. There were prisoners to redeem, and here the Order's counting houses found perhaps their gentlest employment. For the letters of credit that had once moved pilgrims' spending money now moved ransoms, and many hundreds of captives on both sides walked free over the following decades, because a piece of sealed parchment could cross a border that no armed man could. And the West, hearing of Jerusalem's fall, stirred itself for one more great effort, the largest of the age. Kings took the cross in person this time. From England came the most famous warrior in Europe, the tall red-haired king remembered ever after as the Lionheart, and with him and his rivals came fleets that darkened the harbours of Sicily and Cyprus on their way east. The great expedition of the early 1190s is a story of its own, full of storms and quarrels and marches down the very coast road the Order had patrolled for 70 years, with the white mantles riding vanguard and rearguard, the posts of honour and of danger, in every stage. It recovered the coast. It rebuilt the ports. It did not recover Jerusalem. The 2 exhausted sides settled at last on the sensible peace they might have written years earlier. The coast to the kingdom, the holy city to Saladin, and the roads between open to pilgrims of every kind. The English king sailed for home in October of 1192, and Saladin, worn out at 55, died quietly in Damascus the following spring, mourned, it was said, even by men who had spent their whole lives opposing him. His treasurers found so little in his coffers that his friends had to borrow to pay for his funeral. Somewhere in that detail, the sworn poor of the temple might have recognized a kindred spirit, and perhaps, in the unrecorded privacy of some seaside commandery, an old white-mantled brother said a prayer for him. The chronicles do not say. Night settles over that generation, and the story breathes out and moves on. The century that followed, the 1200s, was for the Order a long, strange, watchful autumn. The kingdom it served was now a ribbon of coastline, rich, urban and narrow, ruled from the great port city of Acre, which swelled into one of the busiest harbours of the entire Mediterranean. And the Order swelled with it. If the 1100s had been the age of the road and the castle, The 1200s were the age of the counting house and the fleet. The temple compound at Acre occupied a whole quarter of the city, walls rising sheer from the sea, with its own harbour gate, its own bakehouses and dormitories and infirmaries, and a tower so stout that visitors called it the strongest work on the coast. Trade poured through the city, silks and spices, sugar and glass, and the order, holding farms and warehouses and ships, prospered in the thick of it. In Europe, meanwhile, its houses had become fixtures of ordinary life. The temple enclosure in Paris was a walled town within the city, its keep the safest strong-room in France, where the crown itself banked. The round church in London, consecrated a generation earlier, stood at the centre of English legal and financial life, and kings met their councils in its chambers. A merchant in Provence could pay a debt in Acre without a single coin leaving his city. A widow in England could keep her inheritance in a temple vault against grasping relatives. Boys grew up in villages that had never seen a night, wearing out their childhoods in fields that quietly paid, through rents and wool, for a wall on the far side of the sea. Yet under the prosperity, the arithmetic of the East was changing, gently and without mercy. The crusading passion of Europe, which had burned for a century, was banking down into embers. Expeditions still came, but smaller, rarer and more distracted, and some of them, to the grief of honest men everywhere, wandered off entirely to fight other Christians for money. The popes who had once summoned kings eastward now spent their letters on quarrels closer to home. And on the far side of the world, in movements of peoples that no one on the coast could see or imagine, new powers were rising, horsemen from the great grasslands whose coming would rearrange every kingdom of the region, and after them, in Egypt, a disciplined soldier caste that would produce the most formidable army the order had ever faced. The white mantles read the signs the same as sailors read weather. Their letters home in those decades grow quietly urgent, always the same requests. Men. Money, grain, and always the same patient accounting of towers repaired and truces kept. They were doing what they had always done, holding the road while the world decided what it wanted. And for 50 more years, remarkably, it was enough. Children in Acre grew to middle age in a city of markets and bells. Pilgrims still landed with the spring sailing. The offices were still sung on time, every day, in every house, from Scotland to the sea walls. Hold on to that steadiness, listener, and let it carry you a little deeper towards sleep, because the order itself was holding on to it too, and it is time for the tide to turn one more time. The 13th century brought the order one last season of strange miracles, and the strangest of them arrived without a single sword being drawn. In the year 1229, a brilliant, unconventional emperor from the West, a man who spoke half the languages of the Mediterranean and kept falcons and philosophers about him in equal numbers, sailed east and simply negotiated. He and the Sultan of Egypt, two subtle minds who understood each other perfectly, agreed by treaty that Jerusalem itself, with a corridor of road down to the coast, should return to Christian hands for a term of years, while the sacred platform, with its shrines, remained in Muslim care. The learned of both faiths grumbled at a peace so unheroic. The pilgrims did not grumble. They came up the corridor road in their thousands, and for a little over a decade the bells of Jerusalem rang for the West once more, without anyone having died for it. the order found itself again on its oldest road, watering the same wells its founders had watered a century before. Some things in this story change beyond recognition. Listener, the 40 miles from Jaffa never did. It could not hold, of course. The treaty lapsed, politics shifted, and in 1244 the city passed out of Christian hands again, this time finally, this time for centuries. Far away in Europe, a devout young king of France, Louis IX, a man so scrupulous that his own servants' meals were weighed against his conscience, took the cross and led what proved the last great expedition of that age. It struck at Egypt, flooded rivers and fevers turned it back, and the king himself was taken captive with most of his army. And here, one final time, the order's ledgers stepped quietly into history. Part of the enormous ransom that freed King Louis was raised on the spot aboard the fleet. From the treasure galley of the order, the strong box of the East floating at anchor, because when every other institution failed, the brothers' credit still stood. The king went home, chastened and saintly, and spent 4 years first in the Holy Land, rebuilding walls with his own royal hands beside the masons. The order worked at his shoulder. They were very good years, the last truly hopeful ones, and old men remembered them afterward with the particular fondness we keep for the final warm days of autumn. Then the world turned again, and the new age had no room in it for a ribbon kingdom by the sea. Out of the distant east came the great horse peoples, reshaping every land they touched, and in answering them Egypt forged the finest army of the age, a brotherhood of soldier slaves raised from boyhood to nothing but discipline and war, men in some ways eerily like the military orders themselves. When those two great powers had settled their affairs, the victors in Egypt turned their attention to the coast, and through the 1260s, one by one, with siege engines and patience, the strongholds of a century began to fall. The white fortress at Safed fell, and its garrison with it. The castles of the hill country followed. Antioch in the north, one of the oldest Christian cities on earth, fell in a week. Each year the maps in the order's chapter houses needed redrawing, and each year the sea lanes carried the same letters west, calmly written, plainly urgent, asking Christendom to remember its road. Christendom, absorbed in its own quarrels, sent sympathy and small fleets, and not nearly enough. The brothers did what garrisons do in a long retreat. They held what could be held. They evacuated whom they could save. They bought truces where strength failed, and where a place could not be kept or bought, they took the sacraments from its chapel and its people onto their ships, and sailed to the next wall south and manned it. By the year 1290, all that remained of the kingdom was in effect the city of Acre itself, crowded now with the refugees of every fallen town, and a handful of coastal outposts. What happened in the spring of 1291 has been told many times with trumpets, and we will tell it once, quietly, because the men it happened to were the heirs of everything we have watched tonight, and they deserve to be remembered at the pace of truth rather than of drama. The army of Egypt came north in April with the greatest siege train of the century, and the city, after 6 weeks, could not stand against it. When the walls were finally carried in the middle of May, the last fighting narrowed street by street toward the sea, and it narrowed at the end as everyone had always known it would, to the Temple Quarter, the strongest work on the coast, standing sheer above the water with its back to the waves. For 10 more days the great compound held. Inside were the surviving brothers, and with them thousands of the city's people, women and children and the old, crowded into the vaulted halls where a century of pilgrims had once slept in safety. The Order's ships and every hull that would float worked back and forth to Cyprus through those days and nights, loading from the Seagate, riding low. Returning, the Marshal of the Order, commanding the defence, fell in the fighting at the breach. The commander of the house treated for terms to let the last of the refugees go unharmed, and when the terms broke down, the defence went on, and the tower they held came down at last with defenders and attackers together in its fall. It was the 28th of May, 1291. The Order's standard came down with the tower, and with it, after 172 years, the Crusader mainland was finished. Take a slow breath here, listener. The men on the walls of that quarter spent their last strength exactly where the first 9 had spent theirs, standing between danger and the helpless. Whatever else history came to say about the Order, and history was about to say terrible things, that final image was clean. They ended their kingdom's story the way they had begun their own, holding a gate open long enough for others to walk through it. What was left of the Order gathered itself on the island of Cyprus, a short sail and an entire world away from its graves. From there the brothers kept up the old fight in the only ways still open. Their galleys patrolled against pirates and raided along the hostile coast. For a strange decade they garrisoned a tiny waterless island called Ruard, 2 miles off their old fortress town of Tortosa, the very last scrap of the Crusader coast, holding it as a stepping stone for a return that never came, until it too was lost in 1302, and with it the final foothold. The dream of recovery did not die quickly. The Pope spoke earnestly of new expeditions. Plans were drawn, taxes proposed, memoranda written by every strategist in Europe. But the tide of the age had genuinely turned, and most of Europe knew it, even where it could not yet be said aloud. And that quiet knowledge raised, in courts and universities and taverns, a question that had never been asked in 2 centuries, and it settled over the Order's houses in Europe like the first cold draught under a door. What, exactly, were the Templars now for? The Hospitallers had their hospitals, and would soon have an island kingdom of their own to govern. The other orders had frontiers to hold elsewhere, but the Order of the Temple had been built for one purpose, sworn to one road, and the road was closed. Its wealth remained, enormous, visible, and increasingly commented upon. Its privileges remained, its immunities, its walled enclosures at the heart of great cities, answerable to no one but a distant pope. Thoughtful men proposed merging the 2 great orders into one. Others suggested the military brotherhoods should be set under kings. Pamphleteers, the age's murmuring conscience, wondered in writing why men sworn to poverty should keep the treasury of France. None of this was yet hostile. Exactly. It was the sound a society makes when a great institution has outlived the world that created it. A sound of shifting, of reassessment, of accounts being silently opened. In the Order's houses the offices were still sung on time, the poor still fed at the gate, the ledgers still balanced to the penny. the brothers were doing nothing they had not done, faithfully, for 7 generations. That was precisely the trouble. The world around the routine had moved, and the routine had not. And into that gap between an unchanged order and a changed world there now stepped, from opposite directions, 2 men whose names have been bound together ever since. An old soldier and a young king. The old soldier was named Jacques de Molay. He had joined the order as a very young man in a small stone chapel in Burgundy in the year 1265, when Acre still stood and the order still guarded a real road in a real kingdom. He had spent his whole life in the East and in the saddle, was present for the bitter last years of the mainland, and around 1292. In the shaken aftermath of Acre, his brothers elected him Grand Master, the 23rd man to hold the office since Hugh of Payens. Those who dealt with him describe a man brave, stubborn, honest, and plain, a soldier of the old school promoted into an age that had begun to require a politician. He believed with his whole heart that the crusade would come again, and that his task was to hold the order ready for it, unchanged, unmerged, and unbowed. He spent his mastership crossing and recrossing the sea, inspecting houses, tightening discipline, lobbying popes and kings for the great expedition, and resisting, politely and immovably, every clever scheme to fold his brotherhood into another. History has sometimes been hard on him for that stubbornness. It is worth remembering, gently, that the thing he refused to surrender was not power. It was a promise, made by 9 men on a dangerous road, which he did not consider his to break. The young king was Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair for his handsome face, a monarch of icy piety and iron will, served by a new kind of royal servant, lawyers, men of files and precedents, who believed the crown of France stood above every earthly thing and most heavenly ones. Philip's reign was magnificent and permanently short of money. He had fought ruinous wars, debased his own coinage until the markets of Paris rioted, taxed the church until a pope died of the quarrel, and struck, one by one, at every wealthy group within his reach, whose money could be made to answer the crown's need. The pattern of his methods was established and public long before it turned toward the white mantles. Sudden arrests at dawn, sweeping charges prepared in secret, confessions gathered under pressure, then published widely. It was a machine, efficient and modern and cold, and by 1306 it had run short of targets. The king owed the temple money. The temple's Paris keep held the safest vault in his kingdom, which was not his, and the order, wealthy, privileged, purposeless in the public eye, and protected only by a pope who happened to be weak, timid, and living in France itself, stood directly in the path of that machine, going about its bells and its bread, suspecting nothing it was willing to believe. The whisper campaign began, as such things usually do, at the bottom. Around 1305, a drifting former brother, a man who had been expelled from the order and had reasons to want revenge and reward, began telling officials a lurid story. He claimed that behind the order's famous discipline lay secret ceremonies, that new brothers were made to deny their faith in hidden midnight rites, to spit upon the cross, to worship strange idols. It was exactly the kind of tale that had been told about unpopular groups since Roman times, almost word for word, and learned men knew it. But it was also exactly the tale the king's lawyers had been waiting for. The stories were collected, refined, and quietly shaped into a legal instrument. Spies were slipped into the order's houses to gather colour, and through 2 years of patient preparation, the great engine of the king's government was aimed, in perfect secrecy, at the oldest brotherhood in Christendom, while the brothers themselves went on shoeing horses and singing psalms and feeding the poor at their gates, keeping a routine so unchanged that on the very last evening of their old world, no chronicle records a single house that suspected anything at all. The Pope Clement V had heard the rumours, because everyone at court eventually heard everything. He was a Gascon, gentle, learned, chronically ill, and painfully aware that he owed his election to the influence of France and lived within arm's reach of the crown itself. In the summer of 1307 he discussed the accusations with the king's men and with Jacques de Molay himself, who had sailed from Cyprus at the Pope's invitation to discuss, of all things, plans for a new crusade and the possible union of the orders. Molay, confident in his brotherhood's innocence, actually asked the Pope to open a formal inquiry and clear the order's name. Clement agreed to look into the matter in his own time, in his own courts, and wrote to the king in late August saying precisely that. The king did not wait for the Church's slow justice. On the 14th of September 1307, sealed orders went out from the royal chancery to every royal official in France, to be opened on a fixed day and acted upon at dawn, everywhere simultaneously for nearly a month, in hundreds of towns. Those letters sat locked in strong boxes, while the officials who guarded them kept the king secret. The order's houses lay open as always. October ripened. The grapes came in. And in the small hours of Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, the doors of every temple house in France were knocked upon at once. Let us keep this hour as quiet as the houses themselves were. There was, with scattered exceptions, no resistance at all. The brothers were men under vows, most of them elderly, most of them farmers and shepherds and clerks and infirmary attendants, and their rule bound them to obedience toward lawful authority. When the king's men read out the warrant, house after house simply submitted. Old men were helped onto carts. Keys were handed over, inventories begun, the animals fed by strangers that evening. In Paris, the great keep of the Temple, the strongest vault in the kingdom, was open to royal officers, and Jacques de Molay, 70 years old, who only the day before had stood in a place of honour at a royal funeral, holding a cord of the coffin's pull beside princes, was taken into custody with 60 of his brothers. Across France, in a single autumn day, somewhere near 15,000 men, knights, sergeants, chaplains, shepherds, mill hands, passed from their dormitories into the king's keeping. The bells of their chapels, which had rung the offices without fail for 188 years, went silent between one morning and the next. And in that silence the medieval world woke to news it could scarcely comprehend. The arrest warrant itself, drafted by the king's lawyers, opened with words designed to be read aloud in market squares, and they show exactly the pitch at which the crown wished the affair to be heard. A bitter thing, a lamentable thing, it began, a thing horrible to contemplate, and terrible to hear. It heaped the words up like kindling, calling the alleged crimes a detestable disgrace, an abominable work, a dreadful infamy, a thing altogether inhuman. The document went on to accuse the brothers of crimes it called an offence to divine majesty, a disgrace to humanity. Strong words, written before a single Templar in France had been asked a single question. What followed in the weeks after the arrests belongs to the saddest and best documented chapter of the story, and we will walk it calmly, without lingering where it hurts. The king's officers had instructions to obtain confessions, and the age's methods for obtaining them were what they were. Weary, frightened, isolated old men, questioned relentlessly and treated harshly, said in large numbers what their questioners required them to say. Within weeks, dozens of confessions to the strange midnight rites had been gathered and published, including, to the shock of Europe, one from the Grand Master himself, made before the university men of Paris and then repeated, under circumstances history still argues about, before assemblies the Crown convened. Modern readers, and indeed thoughtful contemporaries, noticed what the documents themselves make plain, that the confessions repeat the interrogator's script almost word for word, agreeing even in odd details across men who had never met, and that nearly every brother who was questioned beyond the reach of such pressure, in England, in Aragon, in Cyprus, in Germany, calmly denied everything from beginning to end. In lands where the accusations were tested by ordinary process, the order was, again and again, found innocent. A church council in England could establish no guilt. In Aragon the brothers were acquitted. In Germany a synod declared them free of the charges. In Cyprus, where men who had actually served beside them gave evidence, witness after witness spoke of their charity and their steadiness. That pattern, guilt only where one particular kind of pressure reached, innocence everywhere it did not, is the quiet verdict of the archives, and you may rest on it tonight with a clear conscience. Pope Clement's first response to the arrests was, in fact, indignation. The order answered to him alone, and the King of France had seized it without so much as a letter of warning. In late October he wrote to Philip in terms popes rarely used with kings, protesting that you have laid hands on the persons and property of the Templars, and that in this act of yours there is an insult to ourselves and to the Roman Church. He charged that the king had proceeded against all reason and against all right, and reminded him that the brothers are subject to the protection of the Roman Church, and to no lesser power upon the earth. For a season it seemed the Church might simply take the whole matter out of the Crown's hands and let it dissolve. But Clement was ill, isolated and dependent, and the king's ministers were relentless, and the published confessions, however obtained, had done their public work. Step by step through 1308, a compromise was constructed of the kind that satisfies lawyers and breaks hearts. The Pope suspended the Inquisitions in France, then restarted them under formulas that saved his office's dignity. Commissions were appointed, papal and royal, to examine the order and its members separately, a distinction that would matter enormously, and the brothers themselves, shuttled between custodies, discovered the cruel geometry of their position. Before the royal courts, retracting a confession made under pressure exposed a man to the fate reserved for the relapsed, while before the papal commissioners, hundreds upon hundreds of brothers nonetheless stood up, knowing exactly what it might cost, and declared their order innocent and their confessions false. The transcripts of those hearings survive in the archives, question by question, answer by answer, They are among the most quietly courageous documents of the entire Middle Ages, and for a while, in 1310, it genuinely seemed the defence was prevailing. Then the Crown's men shifted ground. A compliant council was convened in a province where the Crown's writ ran strong, and in a single terrible week in May of 1310, 54 brothers who had retracted their confessions were judged relapsed and given to the fire outside Paris. The defence of the order, which had been gathering like a spring, went silent that week out of simple human fear, and every historian who has ever read the record has understood why. We will not stand in that field, listener. We will only note, because it was noted at the time, that the men died protesting their innocence, and that even hostile observers found no triumph in it, and we will let the smoke blow away, as smoke does, and follow the story on toward its strange, quiet end. It helps, amid so much sorrow, to lift our eyes from Paris and look at what became of the order everywhere else, because outside the reach of one particular court the story runs very differently, and far more gently. The arrests of that October Friday had been ordered by the Crown in Paris, and Paris ruled only one kingdom among many where the White Mantles lived. Elsewhere the brothers' fate rested in other hands, and those hands again and again declined to find them guilty. In England the king was slow and plainly reluctant, delaying for weeks, and when at last the hearings were held, the church there could establish no real proof of the charges. A handful of brothers made vague formal admissions to satisfy the process, were reconciled, and were sent off to monasteries with small pensions to live out their lives. In the kingdoms of the Spanish March the resistance was stiffest of all, for there the brothers had spent their whole lives fighting on a living frontier, and were held in genuine honour. In Aragon they refused to submit meekly, drew back into their own castles, and stood siege. One great stronghold on the river holding out for the better part of a year before its garrison marched out under terms, and when the trials finally came, the brothers of Aragon were acquitted outright. On the island of Cyprus, where men who had actually fought beside them still lived and remembered, witness after witness spoke of their courage and their charity, and the order was cleared. And in the imperial lands to the east, when a churchman opened proceedings against them, armed brothers walked calmly into his court and dared anyone present to prove the lies, and the council that heard them declared, in the end, that they were found to be innocent and clean men. Read the map hole, and the verdict is almost embarrassingly plain. Wherever the brothers were judged by their neighbours, in the open they were believed. Only where a single hungry government held them alone in the dark did they confess, and only there did they burn. And there is one act of courage from the very thick of the storm that deserves to be lifted out and remembered, because it is easily the bravest and least known part of the whole affair. During the spring months of 1310, when the papal commissioners at last allowed the order to defend itself, the imprisoned brothers of France, against every expectation, rallied. Hundreds of them, then many hundreds more, came forward to speak for the order, until close to 600 stood ready to defend it, knowing perfectly well that a man who defended the order and was afterward judged to have gone back on a confession could be sent to the fire for it. 2 brothers in particular carried the burden: a learned chaplain named Pierre de Bologna, who had studied law and could argue in the proper forms, and a steady companion at his side. They stood before the commission and denounced the confessions as the fruit of torture, terror, and long imprisonment. They pointed out that the brothers had been held for years by the crown rather than the church, cut off from all counsel, worn down by fear. And they declared, in words the notaries carefully wrote down, that the order was holy and clean and unstained, and free of every heresy and error of which it stood accused, and that no brother of sound mind, questioned in true freedom, had ever confessed to any of it. For a few remarkable weeks that spring the defence gathered such force that the outcome hung genuinely in the balance. Then the crown struck it the only way it could. Pierre de Bologna was moved from his cell and simply disappeared from the record, never certainly seen again, and in the terrible week of burnings that followed, the 600 voices fell silent. Not because they had changed their minds, but because they were afraid, and no honest soul who has read the record has ever blamed them for it. But the words had been spoken aloud, and written down, and kept. The order had defended itself out loud in a court of the church, and the parchment remembers that it did. There is one document from those years that deserves its own gentle moment, because for almost 7 centuries nobody knew it existed. In August of 1308, 3 cardinals travelled on the Pope's behalf to the castle of Chinon, on a river in the west of France, where Jacques de Molay and the other chief officers of the order were being held in the crown's keeping. Away from the royal lawyers, the cardinals questioned the old men one by one, heard their accounts of what the initiation rites actually were and how the confessions had actually been obtained, received their formal repentance for whatever irregularities the order's rough soldier customs had allowed to creep in, and then, acting with the Pope's own authority, absolved them and restored them to the sacraments of the Church. A careful parchment record was drawn up, witnessed and sealed. And then it was filed away, never published, never acted upon in public, a private act of conscience by a pope who could not find the strength for a public one. The parchment slipped out of memory, mislaid in the vast archives of the Church, and there it slept, catalogued under a wrong shelf mark, until a researcher came upon it in the Vatican archives in the year 2001. Scholars call it the Chinon parchment now. Whatever else can be said of the whole sorrowful affair, that sheet of vellum records what the Pope's own representatives concluded when they finally sat alone with the accused. Not monsters. Tired old soldiers, orthodox in their faith, asking to die reconciled. Keep that parchment in mind, sleeping in its archive, as we watch the public story move the opposite way. For the public story now required an ending, and the endings available to the Pope were few. A general council of the Church had been summoned to meet at Vienne, a quiet cathedral city on the river south of Lyon, in the autumn of 1311, with the fate of the order first on its agenda. Bishops came from across Christendom, and it must be recorded, to the honour of that assembly, that they proved unexpectedly stubborn. When the evidence was rehearsed, a clear majority of the fathers wished to hear the order speak in its own defence before any judgment. 7 Templars actually appeared at the council's edge, offering to argue their brotherhood's case, saying that many hundreds more stood ready in the hills nearby. The Pope, terrified of where that road led, had them detained. The council sat through the winter, unconvinced and unhurried. And then, in the spring of 1312, the King of France arrived at Vienne in person, with his brothers and his sons and a body of armed men, and settled himself beside the Pope. and the arithmetic of courage changed. On the 22nd of March, in a session the chroniclers describe as heavy with silence, Clement issued the decision history remembers by its opening words in Latin, a phrase that means a voice from on high. It opened not in triumph, but in grief, declaring that a voice was heard on high, a voice of weeping and of mourning. The bull did not convict the order. This matters, and the Pope was scrupulous about it. The text itself admits that the proceedings did not permit a lawful conviction, and suppresses the order anyway, not by way of judicial sentence, but by way of provision, or apostolic ordinance, for the peace of the Church, because the scandal had made the order's name unusable. An institution 193 years old, with houses from Ireland to Cyprus, was dissolved in an afternoon, by administrative measure, the way one closes an account. No one at Vienne cheered. The bishops filed out into the March wind, and the notaries dated their copies, and it was done. The practical unwinding took years, and it was, in its bureaucratic way, gentler than the storm that caused it. By a second bull that May, the order's property, the farms and mills and vineyards, the commanderies with their barns and fish ponds, the enclosures in Paris and London, all of it was transferred not to the king, but to the Hospitallers, to be used for the same ancient purposes, the defence of pilgrims and the care of the poor. The Crown of France extracted, naturally, an enormous settlement for its costs before letting go, and other kings did the same, and in Spain the properties passed to new local orders founded for the frontier there. But the deep continuity is worth noticing and worth resting on. The wheat kept growing in the same fields. The rents kept feeding hospitals, the chapels kept their services under new custodians, and in many a village the only visible change was the colour of the mantle at the gate. As for the brothers themselves, the thousands of ordinary men who had never been near a battlefield or a courtroom, the Church's final arrangements were almost anticlimactic in their mildness. Those who had been reconciled were assigned pensions from the order's old revenues and sent to live out their days in monasteries and in the houses of other orders. Records from England and elsewhere show old Templars drawing their small allowances for decades afterward, tending gardens in other men's cloisters, dying in their beds in the 1230s of a new century's counting, forgotten by everyone except the almoners who paid them. History's storms, seen up close, so often end this way, not in thunder but in paperwork and pensions and old men sitting in the sun. But the story had one more scene to give, and because of it, the order's ending has never been forgotten by anyone. 4 men remained apart from all these arrangements, the great officers of the order. Jacques de Molay among them, kept in the Crown's prisons while Pope and King decided what to do with prisoners too senior to release and too famous to forget. The decision took until the spring of 1314. On a March day in Paris, on a platform built before the Cathedral of Notre Dame, the 4 old men were brought out before the people to hear their sentence read. They were to acknowledge their guilt one final time in public, and then pass the rest of their lives in perpetual imprisonment. 2 of the 4 bowed their heads and accepted, and went back to their cells, and vanished from history. And then Jacques de Molay, who was somewhere past 70 years old, who had confessed under pressure and retracted and confessed again through 7 years of confinement, stepped forward on the scaffold in front of the cathedral, in front of the crowd, and in the last free act of his life, took it all back. The accounts of that morning agree on the substance of what he said, and one chronicle, written by a man who was in Paris at the time, records his words. "I confess that I am indeed guilty of the greatest infamy," he said, "but the infamy is that I have lied. I have lied in admitting the disgusting charges laid against my order. I declare, and I must declare, that the order is innocent." Beside him, the commander of Normandy, an old brother named Geoffroy de Charny, stepped forward and said the same. Perpetual imprisonment had been the sentence for the penitent. For the relapsed there was only one, and everyone on that platform knew it, including the two old men who had just chosen it with their eyes open. The king did not wait for the church's process. By royal order, that same evening, at vespers, Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny were taken to a small island in the river Seine, within sight of the royal gardens, and there, as the light went out of the sky over Paris, they were given to the fire. The reports of witnesses, hostile and sympathetic alike, agree that both men met the end with a calm that unsettled everyone who saw it, asking only to be turned toward the cathedral, praying aloud, and repeating to the last that the order was innocent. The same account records that the old master asked only that his hands be left unbound, and his face be turned toward the church of Our Lady across the water, so that he might die looking upon it, and that he said again, clearly enough for the near ranks to hear, "The order is pure, the order is holy, the charges are lies, and warned without heat that God will avenge our death, and calamity will overtake those who have wrongly condemned us." A chronicler of the time wrote that the watching crowd went home in silence, in great astonishment at their constancy, and that during the night. People of the city came quietly to the island and gathered the ashes as relics, as one does for saints. The Grand Master of the poor knights had kept, at the very last, the only possession his vows had ever really left him, which was his word. And then came the year that made the legend. Within 5 weeks of that evening on the island, Pope Clement V, long ill, was dead. Before the year 1314 was out, King Philip IV of France, 46 years old and in apparent health, was thrown from his horse while hunting and died soon after. Within a dozen more years, all 3 of Philip's sons had followed him to the grave, each reigning briefly, none leaving a son, and the royal line that men called accursed had ended, and the throne of France passed to another family altogether, which had never happened in 300 years. Chroniclers looked at that sequence, and human nature did what human nature does. Within a generation the story had grown that the old master had summoned Pope and King from the flames to answer before a higher court within the year, and that heaven had heard him. Sober history notes, correctly and a little primly, that no contemporary account records any such summons, that popes were often ill and kings often fell from horses. Legend, which does not answer to footnotes, noted only that they died on schedule. And with that, the true history of the Knights Templar ends, 195 years after 9 poor knights knelt before a king. And the other story, the one that has never ended, begins, every great mystery needs a missing thing at its centre, and the Templar mystery has the finest missing thing of all. The treasure. When the king's officers opened the great keep in Paris on that October morning, They expected to find the fabled wealth of the temple stacked in its vaults, and what they actually found, though the inventories are incomplete, plainly disappointed them. There was silver, there were vessels and vestments and documents beyond counting, but the mountain of coin that royal imagination had promised itself simply was not there, nor did it turn up anywhere else. In house after house, in kingdom after kingdom, the arresting officials catalogued furniture and farm tools, chalices and grain, and nowhere the hoard. And out of that quiet accounting gap grew 700 years of wondering. Where did it go? The sober answer, and we should give it first because it is genuinely soothing in its plainness, is that the treasure was never a mountain of coin to begin with. The Order's wealth was overwhelmingly land, rents, flocks and buildings, and those could not be hidden or carried, and they passed, acre by documented acre, to the Hospitallers and the Crowns, in transfers whose paperwork still fills archives. The Order's liquid money, meanwhile, was always working, out on loan, advanced to kings, moving between houses, exactly as a bank's money is never actually sitting in the branch. Some of it the royal government simply took, in settlements dressed as expenses. That is where the treasure went, say the ledgers, and the ledgers of this order, of all orders, deserve to be believed. But the legend answers, softly, that the books are not quite the whole story. And the legend has a few honest threads to spin with. It is true that the warning signs were in the air for weeks before the arrests, and that some men read them. It is recorded that a number of brothers slipped away just before that Friday, and that a few were caught travelling in disguise. One brother, questioned later, spoke of carts leaving the Paris enclosure at dusk in the days before the arrests, loaded and covered with hay, rolling out through the gates toward the coast. Where those carts went, if they existed, no document says. And it is true, most tantalizing of all, that the Order's Atlantic fleet, the ships based at the port of La Rochelle, which had carried wine and wool and silver up and down the western sea lanes for a century, is simply absent from the records of the arrests, not seized in port, not inventoried, not mentioned. A fleet does not dissolve into mist, says the legend, leaning closer to the fire. Ships went somewhere, and into that single archival silence, generations of storytellers have sailed whole navies, laden with the lost silver of the temple, bound for Scotland, for Portugal, for hidden harbours no map records even in the boldest tellings, for shores across the Western Ocean itself, generations before anyone from Europe was supposed to have seen them. The historian notes gently that coastal shipping was rarely inventoried anywhere, that most of the Order's ships were leased seasonal vessels rather than a standing navy, and that silence in a medieval archive is the most ordinary thing in the world. The legend thanks the historian kindly and goes on telling the story because a fleet of white sails vanishing over a night horizon with the wealth of an age aboard is not a thing the human imagination has ever agreed to give up. Scotland took the tale and made it a national romance. The King of Scots in those very years was under the Church's ban, excommunicated and at war, which meant, so the story runs, that papal decrees dissolving the order had no force in his realm, making Scotland the one corner of Christendom where a hunted Templar might breathe free. Chroniclers of later centuries embroidered a splendid scene a charge of unknown knights appearing out of the summer dust at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, turning the day for Scotland's freedom. Veterans, of course, of the dissolved Temple. Sober history finds no knights in that dust, only the ordinary miracle of determined spearmen. But south of Edinburgh there stands a small church of astonishing beauty, Rosslyn Chapel, carved in the 1400s by a family long whispered to have Templar connections, every inch of its stone crowded with vines and stars and strange symbols that no one has ever fully explained. Beneath its floor lie sealed vaults that have not been opened in centuries. "What sleeps down there?" say the guides, lowering their voices as the afternoon light slants through the carvings. Well, no one can say. Engineers with instruments have detected only what one would expect: old air and old stone and the graves of old knights in their armour. The vaults stay sealed. The whispers stay warm. It is a very Scottish arrangement, and everyone seems content with it. Portugal, meanwhile, offers the one Templar afterlife that is not legend at all, but sober, documented, glorious fact. The King of Portugal had no intention of destroying an order that had helped build his country and still guarded its frontiers, and he found a solution of beautiful simplicity. He dissolved nothing. He merely renamed. By careful negotiation with the Pope, the Templars of Portugal were transferred, with their castles, their lands, and in many cases their same living members, into a brand new brotherhood called the Order of Christ, headquartered in time at the old Templar convent of Tomar, whose round church stands to this day, ring within ring of painted stone. One of the loveliest buildings in that whole sun-washed country. And this reborn order, generations later, funded and guided the great age of Portuguese exploration. The Prince history calls the navigator was its governor, and he spent its revenues on ships and schools of seamanship and expeditions down the coast of Africa. The caravels that felt their way south and east to open the sea roads of the world sailed. By his order, under the order's insignia, a great red cross squared at the ends, painted on their white sails. Watch that image for a moment, drifting there at the soft border of sleep. The red cross on white, born on a 40-mile pilgrim road in the hills of Judea, catching the trade winds off Africa 2 centuries after the order's ending, guarding travellers still. Only now the road was the ocean, and the pilgrims were sailors, and the wells along the route were harbours that had never before held a western hull. Institutions die. Listener, purposes, it seems, only change their clothes, and everywhere else the order left its name on the land like a ring left on a table, and the land has never wiped it clean. In London, the order's round church still stands between Fleet Street and the river, its floor lined with the stone effigies of armoured knights, their legs crossed, their hounds asleep at their feet. And the whole legal district around it still bears the order's own name to this day, so that a barrister giving her address in this present hour names the poor knights without knowing it. Paris kept its Temple Quarter and its Temple Street long after the Great Keep was pulled down. Across France and England and Spain, hundreds of villages and farms still answer to names like Temple this and Temple that, each one the ghost of a commandery, a place where once every day for 2 centuries bread went out at a gate at noon. Travellers passed through them on modern roads, past a temple farm here, a temple mill there, and never once wonder. But now and then someone does wander and pulls the thread, and finds beneath the ordinary name the whole vast story we have been telling tonight. The 9 nights, the white sails, the vaults and the lantern, all of it folded quietly into a word on a road sign, sleeping there, as history mostly sleeps, in plain sight. The date itself became folklore. Friday the 13th. You have heard all your life that it is unlucky, and if you ask why, someone at the table will eventually say, with confidence, that it goes back to the morning the Templars were taken. The truth, as usual, is gentler and stranger. Fear of Fridays is old, and fear of the number 13 is old, but the two fears seem not to have married until surprisingly recent times, and the earliest clear traces of the combined superstition date only to the 1800s. The connection to the order was drawn afterward by modern writers who noticed the coincidence of the calendar and found it too perfect to resist. And honestly, who can blame them? It is too perfect to resist. Somewhere tonight a hotel has no 13th floor, an airline has no 13th row, and a dinner host quietly recounts the chairs, and none of them know that the shiver they are honouring was retrofitted, centuries later, onto the quietest arrest in medieval history. Folklore does not need to be true to be faithful. It only needs to be told, and this one is told every time that Friday comes around, which means the order is remembered in a small, wrong way by millions of people who have never heard its name. Then there are the stories about what the brothers were said to guard, and here the legend rises into its grandest register. It began with the accusations themselves. Among the charges of 1307 was the claim that the brothers secretly venerated a mysterious idol, a head, described by different frightened witnesses as golden, bearded, painted, or ancient, and given in some depositions a strange name that scholars have puzzled over ever since. No such object was ever produced. No two descriptions agreed. The head was, in all likelihood, nothing more than the echo of reliquaries, the ornamented containers in which every medieval church kept the relics of its saints, refracted through fear and suggestion into something sinister. But a mysterious head that was never found is simply irresistible, and upon that empty pedestal later ages placed treasure after treasure. Some said the brothers had dug beneath their first home, the old palace on the sacred platform in Jerusalem, down into the vaulted halls where their horses were once stabled, and had found there the lost furnishings of Solomon's temple. The Ark of the Covenant itself, carried west in secret and hidden against the ages. Some said they held the true cross, or the embalmed head of a saint, or scrolls of forgotten scripture that would rewrite the faith. And in the grandest version of all, born when the trial records met the old romances of King Arthur's court, it was whispered that the thing in the order's keeping was nothing less than the Holy Grail, and that the last knights carried it away on that vanished fleet, and that somewhere in a sealed vault in Scotland or a hill in Portugal or a cave no map records, it waits there still. Archaeologists have in fact tunnelled and surveyed beneath the old platform's southern vaults, and they report medieval masonry, crusader horseshoe nails, and dust. The legend hears this and smiles, and observes that of course that is what one would find if the treasure had already been moved. The modern age gave the story one more strange and durable home. In the 1700s, the lodges of the Freemasons, then spreading through the cities of Europe, went looking for an ancient pedigree, and some of their storytellers reached back and claimed descent from the dissolved order, weaving elaborate rituals of remembrance around the martyred Grand Master. Historians find no documentary thread connecting the two brotherhoods across the 4 intervening centuries. But the adoption stuck, and through it the Templars entered the bloodstream of every secret society romance the modern world has produced. From there it was a short step to the novels, and the novels came in their hundreds, and then the films, treasure hunters rappelling into crypts, codes hidden in old paintings, orders that never died working behind the scenes of history. Some of it is splendid entertainment. All of it, the scholars sigh, is invention. And yet notice, listener, what the invention keeps insisting on underneath its costumes. Every version of the myth, however wild, circles the same conviction that these particular men were keeping something precious, and kept it faithfully, and would not give it up even at the end. The myth has terrible history and perfect instincts. Strip away the golden heads and the midnight fleets, and that conviction is simply true. What they kept was a road, and a promise, and their word on a scaffold. The treasure of the temple was conduct. It is the one telling of the story in which the treasure has been found. While the legends multiplied, the patient work of history went quietly the other way, into the archives, and the archives turned out to hold nearly everything. The trial transcripts survive, thousands of pages of them, question and answer, in the careful Latin of the notaries. The orders, charters, and account rolls survive in their thousands, so that a scholar today can tell you what a commandery in Provence paid its shepherds, and how many cheeses the sisters of one small house sent to market in a given year, and what it cost to ship a warhorse from Marseille to Acre. The rule survives complete, in its original form and in the long later versions that grew around it, hundreds of clauses of homely instruction about horses and candles, silence and soup. And piece by piece through the last 2 centuries, historians read it all, and out of the reading came a picture calmer and more human than either the prosecutors or the romancers would recognize. When the Chinon parchment finally surfaced from its misfiled sleep, the Church itself, in 2007, published it in a great facsimile volume, and scholars gathered at a conference in Rome to review the whole affair, and the general verdict of modern scholarship was said aloud in the very city that had once signed the suppression. The order, on the evidence, was innocent of heresy. The confessions were the fruit of coercion. The dissolution had been an act of politics, not of justice. It changed nothing, of course. There was no order left to restore. But it is worth something, on the long ledger of the world, that 700 years after 2 old men were burned at dusk for retracting a lie, the institution whose name had been used to condemn them looked into its own oldest cupboard, found the record of their absolution, and set it where everyone could read it. Ledgers, as the brothers always knew, are patient. They balance late, but they balance. Before we let the story go entirely, let us sit a little longer with the gentlest thing the order ever made, which was not a castle or a bank or a fleet, but a way of living, written down in plain words and followed by thousands of ordinary men for the better part of 2 centuries. The rule survives complete, and reading it now is like opening a window into a quiet house. It is not a book of battles. It is a book of bread and candles and horses and kindness, and much of it could be read aloud tonight as a lullaby, because that is very nearly what it is. It instructed that in the dormitory a light shall burn until morning, so that no brother need wake in fear of the dark. It instructed that the brothers eat their meat in common, 2 by 2 from a shared dish, so that the one may have as much as the other, and that any who was too ill or too weak be served first and most tenderly. It set aside a fixed portion of everything the house produced for the poor at the gate, so that hunger outside the walls would always meet bread. It forbade fine clothes and pointed shoes and every kind of showing off, and it forbade, in a line that still makes readers smile, words that are idle or that provoke laughter unbecomingly. It commanded that a fixed share of the loaves go to the hungry outside, instructing that the 10th part of the bread be given as alms. It ordered that a sick brother be nursed with the greatest tenderness, as if the Lord himself were lying ill, and that the aged and the failing be kept in honour to the very end of their days. It gave each knight his 3 plain horses, and told him to keep no lock upon his bag, and no secret from his brothers. And it reminded every man who took the habit, again and again, in a dozen homely ways, that he had come not for glory and not for comfort, but to spend himself quietly for others, and that this spending was itself the whole reward. Rules can be cruel things. This one, for all its severity, was built out of care, and the men who lived inside it, whatever the courts of a later age chose to say, lived by it faithfully to the end. The rule was honest, too, about the hardness of the life, and never more movingly than in the words spoken to a man on the night he asked to join. Before he could take the habit, the brothers sat him down and warned him plainly what he was choosing, in words the ceremony carefully preserved. "You see us well clothed and well mounted, and think that all is at ease with us," they told him. "But you cannot know the harsh commandments that lie within. For when you would wish to be on this side of the sea, you will be sent to the far side. When you longed only to sleep, you will be made to keep watch. And when hunger came upon you and you would gladly have eaten, you will be made to go without." Only when a man had heard the very worst of it, and still asked to remain, was he received at last. And then he knelt, and made his promise, and rose a brother, with nothing of his own in all the world, and a bed among strangers who were, from that night forward, his only family until the day he died. It is worth walking, too, before we rest, through the buildings the order left behind, because stone remembers what parchment forgets, and the brothers wrote a great deal of themselves in stone. Wherever they settled for long, they liked to raise a church that was round. The shape came from the holiest building they knew, the great domed church in the holy city that stood over the empty tomb at the very centre of their faith, and they carried its circle across the western lands the same as another man might carry a keepsake from home. A round church rose in London, and another in Cambridge, and others in Paris and in distant Segovia, in the dry hills of Castile, and the loveliest survivor of them all still stands at Tomar in Portugal, ring within painted ring, so quiet at midday that a visitor can hear the swallows in the roof. To step into one of these round churches now, out of the noise of a modern street, is to feel the whole temperature of the story drop into stillness. The light falls grey, and even from above, the circle gathers you in. And around the walls, in London and in a scattering of old parish floors, lie the stone knights. The carved effigies are among the tenderest monuments the Middle Ages ever produced, and the order left more of them than almost anyone. Cut in pale stone and laid flat upon the ground, the knights rest in their long mail, with their hands folded upon their breasts, or their fingers resting on the hilt of a sheathed sword, and many lie with their legs crossed at the ankle, a fashion of the carvers that later ages wrongly imagined marked a man who had journeyed to the holy places. Their faces are calm. Small stone dogs sleep at their feet. Time and the tread of the living have worn some of them smooth as river stones, so that a visitor kneeling close can hardly find where the nose once was, and still the calm survives in the softened stone. The deep, unhurried calm of men who finished their work a long time ago and laid themselves down. Children in the London church have been lifted up for centuries to look at them, and told, in a whisper, that these are the knights of the old order, and have carried the image away into their own long lives. You may carry it too, gently, towards sleep. Somewhere in the dark tonight, in the round churches of 3 countries, the stone knights are lying exactly as they have lain for 700 years, hands folded, dogs asleep, the circle holding, the offices long since sung and over. There survives as well a memory of the brothers that comes not from their friends but from a neighbour across the old divide, and it deserves a hearing at this late hour, because it is warmer than anything their prosecutors ever set down. In the years of the order's strength there lived a Syrian gentleman named Usama, a poet and huntsman and diplomat who knew the Crusader coast intimately, and wrote in his old age a book of recollections. He had every reason to scorn the newcomers from the west, and about many of them he was witheringly funny. But of the brothers of the temple he wrote with an affection that has surprised readers ever since. He remembered that when he came to the holy city and wished to pray, the order, who then held the ancient sanctuary, would set aside a small space for him and keep the peace while he prayed. The Templars, he wrote plainly, were my friends. Once, he recalled, a newly arrived Western knight, not understanding the custom, seized him during his prayers and turned him roughly to face another way. And it was the brothers who hurried over at once, drew the man off, and apologized, explaining that their guest was a stranger who had never before seen anyone pray in that manner. They were the ones who took care of me, the old man wrote, across all the blood of that hard century, a small warm sentence that has outlasted armies. Whatever else the order was, it was capable of that, and a neighbour remembered it and wrote it down. And what had the brothers been promised they were at the very beginning, before any of the wealth or the wars or the ruin came? For that we have the actual words, because the great abbot Bernard, who had spoken for them at the start, wrote them a letter of praise that survives entire, and it belongs here at the close, laid quietly beside everything that followed it. Bernard wrote that something new had come into the world. A new knighthood has arisen, he declared, in that land which the dayspring from on high once visited in the flesh. He set the sworn brothers against the vain, glittering knights of the west he so despised, with their painted shields and their long hair and their quarrels over nothing at all. He turned on those worldly knights a scorn that still crackles on the page. What then is the end or the reward of this worldly knighthood, or rather knavery? He demanded. You cover your horses with silk, and drape I know not what bright rags upon your armour. You paint your shields and your saddles, and thus arrayed you rush upon your ruin, feeling neither fear nor shame. Of the brothers he wrote that they lived without wives and without children, and, more startling still, without anything of their own, not even their own wills. Among them, he marvelled, there was neither distinction of persons nor respect for rank. The well-born and the low-born eating from the same dish and sleeping in the same plain room. Insolent speech, useless deeds, immoderate laughter, every murmur and complaint, he wrote, if they are noticed, do not go unpunished. They shunned, he said, all excess in food and clothing, desiring only what is needful. And of their strange double nature, monks who fought and soldiers who prayed, he made one severe and beautiful phrase that has never been bettered, calling them men who were gentler than lambs and fiercer than lions, possessing at once the mildness of the monk and the courage of the knight. He even described their rough soldier's appearance with a kind of tenderness, picturing a brother unkempt and unwashed, his hair shorn close, begrimed with dust, and browned by his coat of mail and by the heat of the sun. It was a very high thing to be told you were. And the wonder of the order, reading the whole story to its end, is not that the brothers always lived up to it, for of course they did not, being men, but that so many of them, in the plain unwatched daily round of bread and prayers and horses, so nearly did. They kept, as well, a prayer of their own, taken from an old psalm, which they said before their battles and after them, and which fits at this hour as well as any epitaph a story could ask for. They were forbidden to boast. They were forbidden to claim any victory as their own doing. And so they gave the whole of the credit away in a handful of words far older than their order, and repeated them until the words were worn as smooth as one of their own stone effigies. Not to us, O Lord, they prayed, not to us, but to your name give the glory. 9 poor men had lit a lantern on a dangerous road, and their sons had built the treasuries of kings and the fleets of an age, and at the close of every single day of it, in every house from the hills of Scotland to the walls above the sea, they knelt together and said that none of it had ever been for themselves. Whatever the courts of Paris decided, that prayer is on the record too, and it had been said several million times before anyone thought to accuse them of anything at all. It should be said plainly, so that the fire does not have the last word, that the work the brothers had done did not truly stop. It only changed hands. When the orders' lands passed to the Hospitallers, they passed to men sworn to the very same 2 duties the temple had served from its first morning, the care of the poor and the guarding of the pilgrim, and those men carried the duties onward. The bread still went out at the gates, the sick were still nursed in the long clean wards, and the Hospitallers, given at last an island of their own, spent the centuries that followed as the shield of the whole sea, holding first Rhodes and then Malta against fleets far greater than any the temple had ever faced, so that the road to the holy places, which had begun this entire story, stayed open under other crosses long after the last brother of the temple had died in a quiet bed. In the Spanish kingdoms, the old houses became the seed of new orders raised for a different frontier, and their knights rode the dry marches for generations more. And in Portugal, as we have seen, the brotherhood did not so much end as change its coat, and sailed out under a new name onto the widest road of all. The lantern, in other words, was never once allowed to go out. It was only handed on, from one tired hand to the next, down the long dark road of the years, which is, when you think on it, exactly what the first 9 would have wanted, having never cared in the least whose hand held the light, so long as the road was kept. The modern age, restless and far-travelled, has gone looking for the vanished treasure with shovels and sounding instruments, and the search has become a gentle industry all its own. On a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia, far across the Western Ocean, generations of hopeful diggers have sunk shaft after shaft into a boggy pit. Certain that the Order's fleet crossed the Atlantic and buried the Order's lost hoard deep in the ground there, they have found flood tunnels and old timbers and a very great deal of mud, and never once the treasure, and still they dig. On a windswept island out in the Baltic, enthusiasts have measured the spacing of the old round churches and announced that it hides a map. In a small village in the south of France, a country priest who grew mysteriously prosperous in the 1800s became, a century after his death, the seed of a whole library of speculation binding the Order to secret bloodlines and hidden gospels. None of it has ever yielded a single coin that can honestly be shown to have belonged to the brothers. The historians observe patiently that treasure legends gather around any sudden and unjust fall, that a shovel will always turn up something, and that the human heart would far rather dig for 100 years than accept that the vault was simply empty. And the legend, quite unbothered, keeps on handing out the shovels. Because the story of a faithful brotherhood cut down at the very height of its trust, its wealth spirited away by night to wait for a worthier age, is too lovely a thing for people to lay down, and perhaps it was never meant to be laid down, only told and told again. The grandest telling of all gave the old master one last line as he died, and although no one who actually stood in that Paris dusk ever recorded him saying such a thing, the later storytellers could not resist it. In their version, as the flames climbed on the little island in the river, Jacques de Molay called out to the 2 men who had brought his order down, summoning them to answer for it before a higher court than any in Paris. Pope Clement and you King Philip, the legend has him cry into the dark, "Within the year I summon you both to appear before the tribunal of God." And then, said the tellers, heaven kept the appointment. It did not happen so, or if some words were spoken from the fire, no honest witness wrote them down. But the Pope was dead within weeks, and the King within months, and the tale was already telling itself before the year had turned, and it has never since entirely stopped. So we come back, as the Order itself always came back, to the road. Strip away the 700 years of rumour, the golden idols and the ghost fleets, and the treasure that was never a mountain of coin to begin with, and what remains at the centre is not a riddle at all, but a plain and rather beautiful thing. A handful of men saw that strangers were being hurt and frightened on a lonely road, and they gave their entire lives to standing on that road so that the strangers could pass in peace. Everything else, the riches, the fortresses, the ledgers, the letters of credit that quietly fathered the banks of the modern world, grew outward from that single decision the same as rings spread from a stone dropped in still water. They were not saints, and this story has never once asked you to pretend they were. They could be proud and stubborn and a little too fond of their own freedom, and the age they were born into was cruel in ways that reached even inside their gentle houses. But when they were tested at the very last, in a cell and on a scaffold, the oldest of them chose to burn rather than let a lie stand against the brothers who had trusted him, and that choice is the truest inventory the Order ever left behind. It cannot be loaded onto a cart or sealed inside a vault. It was never lost, and it was never found, because it was never once hidden. It is simply there in the record, where anyone at all who wishes may read it, quiet and plain, the real treasure of the temple, which was the keeping of a promise. And now, gently, our long journey comes to its close. We began this evening not with an army or a fortune or a trial, but with a single small light. Do you remember it from the very start? A pilgrim, footsore and quiet, coming to the edge of a road at the end of a hot day, and a single knight in a plain white mantle bending low over a lantern, coaxing a little flame to life so that a tired stranger would not have to face the coming darkness alone. We have travelled a very long way from that road tonight. We have watched 9 poor men become the most trusted brotherhood of an entire age, and watched that brotherhood raise its castles and launch its ships and count the wealth of kingdoms, and watched it dissolve at the last into legend and rumour and quiet. Empires rose and fell around them across 2 centuries, and 7 more centuries have gone by since. And still, when everything else has been stripped away, what remains at the quiet centre of the whole enormous story is that one small flame, kindled beside that one quiet road. There is something deeply comforting in that, something worth carrying down with you into sleep. The great civilizations of the world, the mighty orders, the treasuries and the fleets and the crowns, all of them rise and pass within the larger, slower rhythms of time, the turning of the seasons, the wearing away of stone, the long patient wheeling of the stars. Kings are thrown from their horses, orders are closed like accounts in a ledger. And meanwhile, in every age, on every dark road, someone quietly kneels and lights a lantern for a stranger, and someone weary walks on toward the place they are trying to reach, and the small kindness outlasts the great power every single time, and asks for nothing, and is mostly never written down at all. The brothers understood this. In the end it was very nearly the whole of what they understood. Not to us, they said, at the close of every day. Not to us. Only keep the road. So let the story settle now, and let yourself settle down along with it. There is nothing left to follow. The 9 have knelt before their king. The white sails have crossed the sea and come safely home again. The stone knights are lying in their round churches with their dogs asleep at their feet, and the lanterns along all the old roads have long since burned down to embers and gone cool. And everyone in this story, every last one of them, has finished their work and lain down to rest, exactly as you are resting now. Feel the soft weight of the covers over you. Let the fan's gentle hum, if you have one going, blend softly into the quiet darkness of your room. Let your breathing begin to slow. Draw one long, easy breath in, and let it go, slowly, and feel your whole body grow a little heavier, a little warmer, a little more at ease against the bed. There is nowhere you need to go. There is nothing you need to keep watch over tonight. The road is being kept. It always has been, by hands you will never know, in a long unbroken line reaching back across the centuries to a dusty hillside and a single flame. You may set the watch down now. You may let all of it go. Thank you for spending this quiet part of the night here, and for travelling the whole long story to its end, or for drifting off somewhere gently along the way, which is just as welcome and just as it should be. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, and only if you genuinely did, you might like the video or subscribe before you sleep, so that we can meet here again on another evening, on another road. And do tell me, whenever you wake, the place and the hour where you were lying as you listened. I love to imagine all of you, scattered across so many quiet rooms and so many time zones, all drifting off together under the same old story. For now, though, there is nothing more to do, and nothing more to remember. Take one more slow breath. Let the last of the day dissolve. Let the lantern at the edge of the road burn low and steady in your mind, warm and gold and faithful, keeping its small light for exactly as long as you need it. And let the gentle current of the past carry you, softly and without any effort at all, down into a deep and peaceful sleep. Rest well. Sleep well. Good night.